Hello everyone, Fru here. Welcome to today's lecture. So guys, in today's lecture, we are in module 6. And in this module, we're going to be talking about functions and methods within Python. There are a lot of concepts we're going to be covering around functions. And some of them includes just understanding what the difference is between functions and method, how to define and call a function or user-defined functions, or UDFs, that's a short term for it. We're also going to look at parameters versus arguments. So this is something that usually comes up. What is a parameter? What is an argument? We definitely want to understand that. And then we're going to look at certain examples of defining functions and passing parameters to functions. So we are going to look at default arguments, required arguments, keyword arguments, passing a variable number of arguments to a functions, defining global versus local variables, trying to understand what's global, what's local, the visibility of variables within a function, how to pass by reference or pass by value to a function. And then we're also going to look at return statements, look at anonymous functions or lambda functions, very powerful. And then we're going to look at pass statements and recursion. So guys, a lot of things to cover within this topic, just because function is a very powerful concept within Python or programming in general. Once you start getting to bigger programs, the things that we've been doing of just writing scripts on the screen is not going to pass, right? We're going to have to encapsulate logic within functions and try to reuse that logic over and over. As always, guys, all this code is available within my GitHub repository. So if you want to get access to all the scripts that we're going to be talking about today, just check into my GitHub repository. The link is going to be in the description. A lot of the examples, I put in a link in here for some very powerful reading, and some of the examples that we're going to go through were inspired by this content. So definitely check it out. That's datacam.com, and the link is on the screen right now. So, but if you go into my GitHub and be able to pull my code, you have all the access to the content that we're going to be covering today. So that said, let's get into our very first concept, which is to talk about functions versus methods. So on the screen here, I have a definition. Let me actually zoom in here, make this next line. All right, and then zoom back out. So it says a function is a piece of code written to carry out a specific task. That's a function. All right, and we're gonna see examples of that. Now, for method, it says a method, and this definition just came from a quick Wikipedia Google online search, so nothing really fancy. So it says a method refers to a function which is part of a class. All right, so that's the difference. So a function is just a piece of code to carry out a specific task over and over, but the method is just a function, the same as a function, but it's attached to a class. It's part of a class. Now, if you don't know what a class is, don't bother. We're going to be covering that in our future. I think that's going to be in module 8, where we talk about classes and object-oriented programming. So that's coming along, but just understand that a method is just a function associated with a class. You can access a method with an instance once you instantiate the class. So if you take a class and you instantiate that, it becomes an object. So once you instantiate the class, you can access the methods of the class. All right, a function doesn't have this restriction. It just refers to a standalone code. So there you go. So the difference between a function and a method, and this will become very clear as we dive in. So that said, let's go into our very first concept within this particular lecture. And I'm going into the working area here to look at that concept of a function. For this one, we are going to do something, right? We're going to get two numbers, A and B. Let's make A 5 and B, say, how about make B 3? All right, now we can go ahead and say print A plus B. All right, this is what we've seen. We're just kind of setting the stage here. We've seen that in Python we can do something like this, and if I go ahead and run this code, it should print us A plus B. Now, what if I want to make this in a way that's reusable over and over without me having to go into this print statement and write print A plus B? It can really be problematic over time. All right, now we can take all of this, wipe it out. All right, and then instead define a function. And the way we define a function is simply the syntax for defining a function within Python is def. All right, just simply start. So we want to go all the way to the far side of the screen, and this is important because if you don't do that, you might have issues. Say if I go space and start trying to define function like this, you might have issues. So we go all the way to the far side of the screen and we say def. All right, so that's simple. Give it the name of the function, any name that you want, but it just has to follow certain criteria. As we've seen a little bit earlier, we cannot be doing numbers in front and doing things like that. So Python has some of those restrictions. So we can define say def, which simply means define def, and we call this function plus. Now a function must take some arguments. Well, not must, but in this case we're gonna take some arguments. If you don't want any arguments, we can leave this blank. If you want arguments, now we can say, okay, we're gonna take 2 arguments. We're gonna take 2 parameters. Let me use the terms correctly. So because we're gonna discuss what the parameter is. So we're gonna take 2 parameters. One is a, and another parameter will be b, and then we can go ahead and end that function. All right, so that's what we have. Now what are we trying to do? We're trying to return a plus b. Okay, so this is what our function is doing. It's going to return for us a plus b, or we can simply say return a plus b. Perfectly fine. We can put it in the bracket or choose not to put it in the brackets. Some people feel that, you know, putting in the bracket makes it easier to read. Now that we have that, this is basically what our function does. You give me one parameter, give me another parameter, and the function is going to take this, is going to add a and b, and is going to return it. Okay, so you might be saying, but Fru, how do I actually use this now? Okay, so we can go down on the screen. Again, we're going now 1 line back to the indentation, because indentations are very powerful within Python. So we're going now 1 line out. So this ends that function. That function is defined, but we need to call it to see something. So now I can say let's say y, say z equals well, let's just actually call the function directly, and then I'll call it with parameters. So we can go ahead and say print, and in this case we can go ahead and say plus. Now we want to add 2 numbers, 5 and 3. All right, so I can say plus 5 and 3, and I'm gonna print that on the screen. So what's happening here is gonna take or we can say x equals to plus 5 and 3. All right, maybe I should put it that way so it's very readable. Then we can go ahead and print x. So what happens once we say x equals to 5 plus 5 and 3? Now it's gonna pass 5 and 3 into our function. Our function takes this number 5 and 3, it adds them, and then it returns a value which is 8. And now 8 comes and is set to x, and now we'll print an x. All right, that's what functions really do for us. Now we've taken this logic of addition, we've encapsulated it into a function which is plus, and then we can call this plus anywhere in your code. If you need to add 2 numbers, you just say plus, and then you give them the number, your function is called, and then there you have it. All right, guys, so this is why functions are very, very, very powerful. Now let's talk about methods very briefly. We're gonna see a lot of examples of functions, but let's switch gears here and talk about methods, because methods are another concept within Python that comes up a lot. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and comment out this piece of code here, so we can define a new line of code, which is gonna be a class. Defining a class might not make sense for this lecture, guys, but bear with me. In the next lecture, which will be module 8, we're really going to be diving into classes a lot more. So let me just do this very quickly and define a class. We're going to call that class. If it doesn't make sense again, just bear with me for now. Let's call that class summation. All right, and we're going to pass it an object. So within that class, we're going to define the method, and we're gonna call that method sum. We'll pass it as self, and in addition to that, we'll pass it 2 numbers, a and b. Then now we're gonna do self the content equals, let's set that to a, so we're gonna add a plus b, and then let's simply return self dot content. All right, so this is our class. We've just simply defined a simple class here. Let me make a comment out here. Class definition. All right, so this is our class. Now we can actually, in this class, we've done a definition here called sum. So this is our method within this class. Now I can go ahead and instantiate this class to say sum instance equals to, and that's just a variable name, equals to summation, right? So I'm simply just instantiating this class, and there's no parameter to pass. There's no argument going in there, so the class is doesn't take an argument, so it's just summation. Now I can say, you know, let's go x equals, let's do sum instance. All right, let's not do sum, we're gonna do sum instance, so we need that. I like to specify it fully, dot sum 5 and 3. All right, and then we can go ahead and run that. Well, I need to print x on the screen, don't I? That's why we see nothing. Print x, which is the result. All right, so if I run that, we go ahead and we see 8 on the screen printing. So I can even do that without this. I think it should still resolve to 8. Oh, okay, actually it doesn't, so we need that in there. All right, so what is happening here? Up here I've defined a class. So again, if we don't understand what a class is, this is really just an abstraction within Python. And under object-oriented programming, we're going to cover it in a future lecture why classes are very important. But again, it's simply a further encapsulation of logic one level above a function. So if you think about a function being an encapsulation of logic, a class is just one level above that. But we're going to talk about that in future videos. So once we've defined our class, the class can have several methods. So in here, this is still a function, but because that function resides within a class, we tend to call it a method. So if you're going for an interview, or you know at your job, and somebody's talking about a function and someone else is talking about a method, then there you have it, right? If it's just not within a class, it's a function. If you start seeing a definition inside of a class, then that's a method of that class. All right, so here we've defined a method. Now this method takes two parameters. Again, a parameter is the variables that show up during the definition of that function or method. So these are two parameters, A and B. We can ignore self for now. So I'm taking the parameters, we're setting that parameter, we're adding the two parameters and setting it to some variable. Again, we're using self there just because it's in a class, and then we return that value. So now to actually access this method, we need to instantiate the class. So here we're saying some instance, right? So we're simply creating an object. So this is called an object of that class. Once you've instantiated the class, that becomes an object. So some instance equals summation. So this is just a method for instantiating a class. And now we're saying x is equal to some instance dot sum. So this dot sum is simply telling us that we're trying to access this method. We're accessing this method within this class, and we're giving it two arguments for it to do the summation. So here, this is parameters. Parameters is simply what is used in the definition of a function or a method, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. Now, once you're passing in specific values to your function or method, those specific values are called arguments. Now, that's the difference between a parameter and an argument. Parameters in the definition, arguments is an actual value that you're passing for that function to do something with. All right, so here we're passing two arguments into that function, and then so the function does its summation, which is the sum. It returns the result for us, and that result is x, and then we can go ahead and print x, which is why we have 8, right? If I change this to 15, all right, it still does the summation, and we go ahead and print 20. All right, so guys, there you have it, the difference between a function and a method, which is really what this lecture was talking about, right? We've understood functions is simply plain definition of something. You can just simply call it. There's nothing about classes in here. It's very simple, not anything complicated. All right, def, you can give it any name. You can say def, so let's say special plus, right? Whatever name you want to give here, that's the name of your function. And then if you say special plus, you come in here and you can simply call special plus any way you want. All right, so you have your parameters, which is what the function definition needs, and once you actually calling that function, you're passing in arguments. So that's the difference, parameters versus arguments. And then we've seen functions versus method. This is a function, a method is simply a function within a class. All right, guys, I hope this helps. This is something that especially for beginner programmers, they kind of always confuse this a lot. At least to me, it was confusing back in the day when I was simply just doing Java and certain other programming languages. This concept was a little bit confusing. I know the class idea might be confusing, but we'll certainly cover that in future videos. That said, this is a segue for us to go into the next piece of this lecture, which we're gonna cover the topic of how to define